really important issue. So here is the plan for today. First, we're going to start off with introductions, and then, of course, I'm the moderator. I've got a bunch of sort of canned questions for our wonderful panels today. That being said, we really want to make sure that whatever we talk about during today's presentation is relevant to all of you. So absolutely feel free to use the chat feature to send us questions. And yeah, I think that's probably the best way to communicate with us. Maybe if we do Q&A later, we could try to, enable video for everybody if we're feeling bold, but who knows, maybe you're all in your PJs and you don't want to do that. So chat is good. And if I don't notice you're chatting, Jenna is going to chime in and help me. So that's the plan. Great. Well, so anyways, yeah, my name is Cary Walski, and I am the moderator for today's session. And what I do, I'm actually a communications consultant, fundraising consultant, and web developer who works with nonprofits. And, through that work that I do a whole lot of communications with marginalized groups. And what I try to do is really take a community-centric approach to the work that I do. And so I know the value of that. And that's why I'm very, very excited to have both Laura Matanah and Nausheena Hussain here with us today to talk about their perspectives. Both these women, they come from very different backgrounds, but even though they come from different backgrounds and different marginalized identities, they have a lot in common. Both of them founded really wonderful, vibrant organizations around the idea of really creating a platform for marginalized folks and underrepresented stories. And so they've got a lot of really wonderful and interesting things to say about this topic. And I'm really excited to introduce them and, help them share their insight with you today. So just a little bit about them. Nausheena Hussain is the founder of Reviving Muslim Sisterhood for Empowerment, or RISE, which has been going strong for 5 years now, which is fantastic. Their mission is amplifying the voice and power of Muslim women, and they do that through storytelling, civic engagement, and leadership development for Muslim women. She has an MBA in healthcare administration and marketing from the University of Minnesota, and has been the winner of many fellowships and awards, including the Bush Fellowship and the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits Catalytic Leader Award, just to name a few. And also we have on the line Laura Matanah, who's currently the Executive Director of Compassionate Action for Animals. She's also formerly the founder and the Executive Director of the award-winning organization Rainbow Rumpus, which she ran for 7 years. And I actually volunteered for her at the time, back when I was a little baby web developer. That's how we met. And yeah, so that was a wonderful organization. While it existed, its purpose was to provide a platform and an online magazine that represented and reflected the lives of the children of LGBTQ families. And it was really the only organization in the world at that time that was doing that type of work. So really cool stuff. So Laura's work and voice is really relevant to, I think, the narratives and themes of this conference, both from that perspective, her experience at Rainbow Rumpus, but also in terms of her personal experience. She was an educator, an elementary educator for many years, and she is also with her partner, they adopted their now adult twin children through foster care. So she has a wealth of experiences to bring to today's conversation. So that being said, that's a little bit about them, a little bit about me. And I think, the best place to begin is really at the beginning, right? So what I'd like to do with Laura and Nausheena is to talk about origin stories. Now, origin stories, they're so important. So many movements and grassroots organizations have really been founded on sort of a seminal story or narrative that really helps define why that mission is important and why people should commit to whatever that cause is. And both Laura and Nausheena have, origin stories to share with you. So I'd like, if both of you don't mind, to share your origin stories. And Laura, if you could maybe start.
Sure. It's great to be with everybody today. So we were sitting around the dining room table and we were sorting our mail, and we happened to have just gotten the Human Rights Campaign magazine. It was sitting there, and both the kids were sitting there with us while we were doing this. And Tasia started flipping through it, and she went, look, it's two moms and twins just like us. And she just kind of like lit up and she was so excited about it. And we just kind of looked up at each other and we just sort of had this moment of like, wow, that means that much to you, you know? And Sarah said to me, we should start a magazine. And I was like, okay, let's do it. So we did.
Yeah, like it's just that easy. I love it. But you absolutely did. And it was a fantastic magazine. Yeah. So, Nausheena, how about yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Laura, that's a great story. I can totally resonate because very similarly, I remember working on doing a PowerPoint presentation for something that I was doing, and I had to look up or add into my PowerPoint pictures of Muslim women. And when I went to Google that, all I saw was negative stories about Muslim women, right? And they were all either victims of crime or perpetrators of like terrorism. So there was nothing positive, and they all looked exactly the same. It was always women in black burqas and, you know, with a very like oppressive sort of narrative surrounding them. And so that coupled with my own journey in the nonprofit sector, I worked in for a civil rights organization, and the majority of the cases and clients that came into our office were women. And so we talk about Islamophobia, but gendered Islamophobia was really what we were noticing. And as so a group of us got together in the fall of 2015, and we started to have this conversation about who is telling our story? Why is there such a negative narrative around us? Why aren't Muslim women portrayed as the leaders and sheroes and change makers that they are, especially around this entire like democratic process of being a part of our communities? And what we came to really understand is, one, we're doing really awesome work, but nobody knows about it. And it's because somebody else is telling our story. And so the only way to reclaim that is to start telling our stories ourselves. And so we launched Rise as a platform in January of 2016. So we're just a little over 5 years old. And I think when it comes to storytelling, you know, you kind of go in phases, right? There's like a PR effort of like reacting to something, and we realized that we would not be able to change the Islamophobic rhetoric if we went out with saying, hey, we're not oppressed, we're not terrorists. Instead, we thought, let's share stories of who these amazing women are in our community by showcasing that work that they're doing, right? So we launched Muslim Sheroes of Minnesota, which is our wonderful storytelling project. And so from PR, we went to storytelling, right? We're telling stories one person at a time. But what we came to realize is that strategic narrative is really the way that we want to move forward, because strategic narrative is not about the moment. It is about a vision of what the future could look like. And what does that future look like? Describing who Muslim women are. How many of you in like kindergarten, when you were asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? All the little boys would say President of the United States. Girls rarely said that, and Muslim girls absolutely did not. And so we felt Muslim girls never had mentors or people they looked up to, because we were never in those stories. There weren't visuals of Muslim women. And so Muslim Sheroes of Minnesota really is another way of providing mentors and role models and amazing sheroes that girls can look up to and be inspired and motivated to really be all that they can be.
That's really wonderful, Nausheena. And I love what you said about this idea of like developing a strategic narrative. I think that's so important. Sort of relating to that idea of just thinking, you know, cohesively about the story that you want to tell and get out there. I'm kind of curious, you know, both organizations, both Rainbow Rumpus and Rise, you know, were structured differently. You know, Rainbow Rumpus was based online, and it really sourced content from folks really all over the nation and to some extent all over the English speaking world. Rise, on the other hand, is a local community that also has connections nationally as well. So, different sort of circumstances. I'm kind of curious from both of your perspectives how each organization actually sourced stories and sort of what the decision making process is in terms of that strategic narrative. Like, how did you select people, and how did that look differently based on how you were situated and what technology and opportunities you're using to kind of get that message out? Yeah, and Laura, I was thinking maybe you could kick
Sure.
us off again.
Nausheena, when you were talking about how when you looked at the narratives that were out there already about Muslim women, and how they were really like flat and stereotypical, I think at the beginning of Rainbow Rumpus, that was really what we saw too about kids and stories about LGBT-headed families. And one of the things was that it really focused on who the parents were, and it didn't focus on the child's experience very much. And so that was what we really looked to shift, Also coming from an education background and having a lot of interest in children's literature and knowledge about children's literature, so like what was out there at the time was like Heather has two mommies. Well, great, but what about Heather? That was kind of our thing. So what we really started with, and partly too because our children were very that story took place when the kids were 4, I think, was children's literature. And so it was not necessarily, in fact, not primarily at all, written by people who were part of, who either themselves grew up with LGBT parents or who identified as part of the community in some sort of way. But they were people who were able to sort of imagine and conceive of something that was very child-centered, but where the family was there, so that kids could see their experience, some aspect of their experience, right? Because our experiences are really varied, reflected, so that they got that kind of affirmation of their family structure being fine, and so could other kids, right? That this was just kind of like a normal thing. Like it wasn't a big deal that there were 2 dads or 2 moms or a single parent or whatever it was, but that these were kids dealing with, being jealous that the other kid at daycare learned how to zip up her coat first, like whatever the things are. So that was really how we started. And then, as that audience developed and we grew, it became clear that we wanted to really share the stories, direct stories of kids themselves, like real stories, And so that was when Cary talked about, kind of our reach. We really did start connecting with children and families from around the country and just also around the world. And we would, people would sometimes contact us. We kind of put we had a newsletter and all of that, the opportunity out there. And we also just did a lot of networking as we got to sort of know people and families to find kids who were just doing interesting things, who were interested in sharing their stories and talking about what they were doing. Nausheena, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. It's so hard when you're on Zoom because you're like, is Cary going to pass it to
Sorry.
me or Laura?
I dropped the ball there.
No, that's fine. We should just pretend we're at coffee and we're just
I
talking.
love that. I'm just
Here for us.
over here anyway, so let's do it.
Yeah. So when we first launched Muslim Sheroes of Minnesota, I was the only person on staff, okay? And I don't even know if I was paying myself at that time. So I personally curated 6 stories to tell. And what was important for me, similar to like what Laura was mentioning, is really to reflect the diversity in who Muslim women are. Again, it like some people see Muslims as like a race, and what really people don't understand is that the the religion expands all over the world, right? So we have not just different race race racial classes, but also ethnicities within those races, and people don't understand that, and they don't understand like the way people practice. Like there isn't a cookie cutter approach in practicing Islam. So we wanted to make sure that our stories didn't actually focus on those things. We wanted to focus on what is she doing in her community. And the running thing that we noticed was there's something that happens that's upsetting in her life that she feels like she has to do something about it, right? Whether it's her son is born deaf and there are no resources in the community, she goes out and she starts building those resources, not just for herself, but for everyone. If it's something to do with going to the grocery store and noticing there are no fruits and vegetables from her own homeland or from her own ethnic background, how does she bring in organic farming into the community, right? So we found it really fascinating that Muslim women were problem solvers, right? Like they weren't just sitting around waiting for permission to make change. They were just going out and pursuing that. And so we've told over 35 stories today, and we still don't feel like we've made a dent in the diversity. Right? The experiences are just so amazing and so vast that we moved to a model where we were soliciting from the community nominations to be a shiro. And so we developed a series of questions because we get a lot of people who are like, oh, you should make Cary a shiro. She's wonderful. Okay, why? Oh, she's great. And so there was like no content behind that. And so we were like, okay, let's put some more questions in there to help people really articulate what is it that makes her an amazing shiro. And once we do that, then our team actually does pre-interviews to get a deeper understanding. And sometimes in the nomination process, we only know one part of her stories. And you know that women are so multidimensional because of the multiple roles that we play every day, all at the same time sometimes, in our communities and families, right? Chelsea's cracking up. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. But that's the truth, unfortunately, fortunately. And so the storytelling really has helped us grow as individuals too, because even for me, I look at some of these and I'm like, gosh, all I'm doing is helping them tell their story. And yet I look back and I'm like, there's so much more that I could be doing, because I'm just so inspired and motivated by their amazing, successful change making stories. And so we really now rely on the community to tell us who's our next shiro, whose story should we be telling, who has not had a platform to tell about the work that they are doing. And sometimes it's funny, women, we're so modest, we don't want to brag, and we don't seem to have that problem with the other genders. And so we have to constantly remind her that this isn't just about her. This is about her work. And it's also about our community being able to see just the potential and vision of what could happen if they just take that one leap of faith and go for it.
Yeah, that's really beautiful, Nausheena. And I love that you started talking a little bit about just the process that you go through now to recruit people and kind of how that's transformed over the years, because that segues really nicely to my next question, which is really about, okay, that process after you identified folks. So you have that person you're going to have a conversation with, you're going to tell their story. Um, at that point, of course, you always want to get a legal waiver. But having that legal clearance to tell a person's story is really just the start of doing a community-centric storytelling approach. So I'd love to hear more just about like what consent looks like for both of you, and kind of how that plays into the process that you have in terms of helping folks whose stories you're telling have the most control over that story as they possibly can, kind of through the process that you have.
Me first or Laura?
Um, why don't you go first this time?
Okay, yeah. So I just remember doing a lot of media interviews and how sometimes your sound bites can be taken out of context and
Mhm.
how like aggravating that is, right? And so
Yeah.
when we invite her into the storytelling process, in that pre-interview, we ask a bunch of questions because our storytelling isn't just a written narrative, but we also have a podcast, an illustration, and sometimes a digital short, like a video. And so there are multiple artists that will be interacting with her. And so we need her permission to be in her space, whether that is in her home, in her workplace, or in her community. And some often we also ask for, we want to see you in the role with your family. So is it okay to film your children? Is it okay to film your spouse? Is it okay to have, these like normal mundane things that you do with your family be part of the story? And so we have to be very conscious about how she wants us to lead that story. And the second thing is, when we first write like our drafts, our storyteller writer actually has the shiro look at that draft and make sure that there is nothing in there that we have like missed the mark on. So she actually gets a chance to read the story before it goes out. And so rarely have we had anybody say, nope, this is completely wrong, or take this out. I know one shiro was just so touched because she had been on like a lot of media, and especially like on front pages of different magazines. And she said, this was the first story that really humanized me, that really brought in the entire, like my own history of like how I got to this point. And so she felt that we really, told her story in the most authentic way possible. And then if you've ever listened to our podcast or watched the video, you'll see that it's just her. It is her voice, it is her sound, it is her story in her own words. We don't manipulate any of the sound bites. You don't even see us, you don't hear us, you don't hear us asking questions. It's all her. And so for us, consent isn't just that legal waiver, it's the fact that we bring her along in the storytelling process.
That's yeah, that's wonderful, Nausheena. And hearing you say that just makes me want to ask a quick follow-up question, which I think is relevant to our audience too. And Laura, maybe you could talk a little bit about this as well. When you're working with marginalized groups or with minors, for instance, you do have to take steps to, really conceal their identity. To, because unfortunately, like, let's be real, online harassment is a thing. I'm just kind of curious, what that looks like for you, and maybe we can talk about Rise first.
Yeah, I mean, specifically for our organization and our staff, we just went through last year an entire security audit, both digitally. And the good thing was, we weren't in our office last year when stuff was happening. We're really strong in our social media presence, and so somebody doxed one of our employees, and doxed means they take your address and put it on the internet and tell bad people to do stuff. And so this is really dangerous, right? Because most of us don't live alone. We live with other family members. And so to protect ourselves and our family, we had to go through an entire audit to protect ourselves. So we had our identity scrubbed from the online presence. We actually removed our staff list from our About Us page on our website. And we know that, especially like in the philanthropy world and in an organizing world, people want to know who works here, who is doing this work. But what we learned was that Islamophobes and white supremacists are actually mapping social justice activists and racial justice activists. And it's not a joke, right? So we are on lists, we are on maps where people are targeting us. And so digital security was like a real priority for us. And we are constantly reevaluating our surroundings, whether they are online or in person, to make sure that we are safe. And so when we think about our sheroes too, we have to make sure we aren't listing out her home address or her phone number, or information that really can compromise her. And so there are times and waves of haters that find us. We've been lucky that it hasn't been a lot, but it's enough to like scare you. And that's the other thing, is we are afraid that if they do anything that scares her, it doesn't just scare her, it scares other sheroes and future sheroes, and then our entire community. And then we have to go back, right? Step back in our social justice work. And so we are very careful about how we portray her identifiers in terms of like where she lives or where she works. And sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's really obvious where they are. And so we try to do our best in balancing that and protecting her.
Yikes. Well, it's a sad statement that all of that hard work is necessary. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that perspective, though. Yeah. So Laura, in terms of your work with Rainbow Rumpus, of course, you've got a different audience. You're telling the stories of a different group, of course. Could you tell us a little bit about, okay, how did that consent look like, when working with children, particularly the interviews I know that we used to do with young people, with youth. And also, if you could talk a little bit about, again, privacy concerns. How do you protect people's privacy, especially, children? That would be wonderful.
Yeah. I don't know, just the impact. I just have to say that I'm just having a moment of just hearing the impact of that harassment, Nausheena, that you had to deal with. And I saw that on your website, and I don't know, I'm just having a moment of taking it in again. And just thinking, how do we as a community stop it, But to kind of return to that question, I will say one thing I'm kind of grateful for was that there was a lot of homophobia, transphobia, certainly at the time. I mean, and that still exists today, and against families, but there also was not the kind of, the social media was just getting going. It's kind of hard to believe that there was a time when this was true, but there was a really different feel. So it was a different world in a lot of ways. And so anyway, we got permission both from obviously the youth themselves as well as parents. And we also did a similar process of running stories by people to make sure that they felt like they were being accurately reflected. We did not share those stories on social media at all. They were really only on our website. And so our promotion of ourselves, we really only use social media as a way to help youth connect with each other, actually. So we had Facebook groups where, like teens could connect and just connect with each other and have like a social group that we provided some moderation support for. But that was like a private group for them, right? It was not something that was out there for the world to see at all. And so I guess that was like one of the ways that we kind of worked to protect people's, safety. We did not have people's, addresses or anything like that also. So from that point of view, although I think we did have first names and last names, so I mean, you probably could track somebody down if you were really determined to do so. But I guess those were the kind of the things that we put into place.
Hard to imagine a time before Reddit now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we could kind of, it was still the Wild West. We could kind of get away with a little more. That's for sure. And yeah, it's really interesting. Just hearing you talk, Laura, just reminds me of just how important it is, the purpose of your group. Like really, you were all about enhancing the lives and validating the experiences of those children and youth. So it makes total sense that really with the social media strategy that you had, you focused on those community groups, those sort of forums online where, youth could connect directly. That makes so much sense. And, whatever you're doing out there, whatever you're planning, always keeping your mission and your purpose and your audience front and center in terms of, how you tell your stories and even what tools you're using to tell your stories is just so important. Absolutely. Yeah. So, I'm just kind of curious. So in my personal experience as a communicator, I do tell a lot of stories, do a lot of interviewing, and for me, it's always the best experience. Like the experience that I'm trying to get to, hopefully, for the person who I'm working with, is really, a process that ultimately feels exciting and empowering and connecting. You know, um, that's what I'm always about. And so, I have my tactics for kind of getting there. Of course, that consent process that I use in my work is sort of similar to some of the things that you've mentioned in terms of your strategy. I've also, kind of with the different groups that I'm working with, have sounding boards sometimes. Folks that I'll kind of pass the story to, in addition to the person whose story that I'm telling, just to kind of do a gut check. That's one of the strategies that I have. So that's kind of how I think, we kind of end up at this place where people, they see their story, they see it in print, and it feels good to them, and I hear that. I'm kind of curious to hear from you both, what has your experience been, for you? Do you find that, as an end result of the sort of storytelling process, that there's not only a change in the community who gets to read their story, but also in the person who has told their story?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's kind of the whole point, right?
Yes. I mean, Cary, when we first started, we thought our audience was going to be outside the Muslim community,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
We weren't even looking at like the extreme opposite of us, but like this movable middle, right? To provide
mm,
alternative, positive perspectives and imagery of who Muslim women are. What we didn't realize was how much it was going to impact her and our community. So when I think about how it impacted her, um, it's not just this feeling of like validation, right? It was just this. It was this moment of I have to keep doing this work. Like
mm,
I'm getting such good feedback from the community after they've read it, seen it, watched it, that I gotta make sure that I continue doing this work. And one of our sheroes, what I thought was so sweet and endearing is, I don't know about some of you, but like when you work in the nonprofit, your family has no idea what you do, right? Like they just think you're some volunteer sitting around, serving meals or something. And I had a couple, like I had one, she uh she was like this NASA ambassador. Like she's trying to
oh,
get
cool.
girls into STEM, right? She works at the
Mm,
Science Museum and stuff. And her dad finally understood what she does because he like read our story and watched the video. And she was like, "You have no idea what that means to me. Like finally my family understands what I do and why I love, the solar system and space and everything." And then what we saw is we saw Muslim women watching these stories and listening and reading and being inspired and being like, oh my gosh, I can do something. I want to step up and I want to go and work in this space or do this and make this change. And that is really what, like the other side of our work is like civic engagement, is like we really want women to feel like, I had this one question, how can I be what I cannot see? Right. So if I don't see Muslim women that look like me doing great things out there, why would I ever think that I had a chance at doing that? And so the stories really provide that. Here's, look at this, see this, be this, right? And then finally, there was so much pride in the Muslim community when these stories were going out, right? Either people were seeing like their own Islamic center, they're seeing their own school, they're seeing their own community center inside of these stories. And there was a sense of like real pride and joy of who they are as a Muslim. And, Islamophobia it's so pervasive because a lot of people internalize it. And so they want to assimilate into the dominant identity by hiding who they are. And these stories really uplift who we are as a community. And there is a lot of just like, you know, like real proud moment of who you are, and to embrace all the different identities that one holds. And so I have seen a really transformational movement almost with this story, because it wasn't just about changing the hearts and minds of people who have negative feelings towards Muslim women, but it was really to inspire and motivate her, so she's making that change in the community.
That's beautiful. And I just love that story about the NASA ambassador and the unexpected ripple effects, with her dad there. That's really wonderful. Yeah, Laura, do you have any stories to tell about, just young people who, reflected later about their experience of having told their story?
As I listened to what Nausheena was saying, I was thinking that in some ways I feel like we almost had the flip experience with Rainbow Rumpus, because we had really perceived what we were doing as something sort of a within the community, the community being children from LGBT-headed homes and their families. And that a lot of what we heard from youth was how much it meant to them for peers or other families, or from different sorts of families, to read their stories and be like really impressed by what they were doing, or and that process of being affirmed in kind of the broader community was really meaningful to them.
Yeah, that's pretty cool how really, if you're able to like listen to your community, really the focus of what you're doing can evolve over time. So that's a really neat reflection there. So sort of related to this, I'm kind of curious. This is an issue that I live, in my storytelling world. I work with a lot of folks who come from backgrounds and identities and ethnicities that I'm not a part of. And I, of course, I have my strategies to, make sure that I'm telling stories as equitably and respectfully as I can. And some of those things I talked about earlier. But I'm just kind of curious, do either of you have recommendations about how one should maybe approach, trying to engage with somebody who is from a different background than you, and you're, trying to do your best to really represent them accurately and respectfully?
Well, I'll tell you what not to do.
Great, I love it. Top 5, what not to do. Let's get the list out.
Like when you're on your own journey to like learn about a different culture. So I'll just I'm going to use you, Laura. So let's say I don't know anything about the LGBTQ community or the blended family or the different family mix that you have. And I come in and I just ask, where's the dad? Or how did you get these children? Right? Like that's really offensive, correct? And I think they're like, don't ask those questions. Just talk to Laura about what it's like being a mom, right? Like ask, I guarantee I don't know how old they are now, but Laura, I'm sure we would have similar stories of what it's like to raise children, what our daughters are going through or sons are going through, right? And sometimes you just need to be like a human, right? And and slowly you will start to observe things that are different, and then you can fill in those holes in your story, like in your own questions and answers of like how things manifest and work or show. And language is really important. I think there are very much there. I had a, we do work in sexual violence awareness, and we do truth telling and healing circles, right? So in healing circles, we don't tell which women, like, this is what you need to answer and this is what you need to share, right? She gets to share what she wants to share, and your job is just to listen. And the only thing we ask is that you tell her that she is brave and that she is courageous and that you believe her. I had an organization say, we want to start doing this work. There's a lot of sexual violence happening. We want to do a confessions session. And I was like, that's the worst word ever. And I thought, confession, like, I mean, that has so much negative connotation, right? And my own husband was like, do you understand confession means like you committed the crime? And I was like, or the sin? Yeah. And so I was like, man, if my husband can figure this out, like, you should too. You should be able to see like how language matters. And so Cary, when you see events that RISE does, and it is space for allies to show up, that's where you come in and you be yourself and you bring your inquisitive self in with a very open mind, and you do more active listening than you do active talking. And it is through relationships that you will be, that your cultural competence will grow, right? I am like, I think about like, I never got to meet Laura before this, right? And so where are the spaces where Laura and I would interact, right? And how do I make sure that stories that Laura is telling are somewhere in my storytelling, right? And I'm sure Laura's probably thinking the same thing. And that's where I think collaborative partnerships show up and support each other. So the work is really like, it is all about like building that trust and showing up in places where it might be uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean make it uncomfortable for others. So that's my advice.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. You know, so many folks, they approach it, they kind of just parachute in and then they like bounce out. You know, I got the interview, it's in the can, we're done. But it is about that relationship building. And one of the sort of recommendations that really stuck with me is just this idea that if you haven't broken bread with a community, you should not be telling their story.
Right.
And I think that that's a wonderful rule to go by. I mean, I think that's real. Yeah.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times dinners and brunches and iftars in the mosques during Ramadan, seders, like all these things are probably where I have learned the most about my, allies in the work. And they're not just allies, right? They really become like family. And I think that is really important, is break bread with each other.
Yeah. And it's just fun. I mean, come on. Yeah. So, Laura, any recommendations from your perspective as an educator, as a Rainbow Rumpus kind of person?
I really don't have much to add to that. I thought that was comprehensive.
Chef's kiss. I love it. Well, this is great. Well, gosh, this has been fun. And, I've got bonus questions, but rather than dive into those things, I thought this could be a wonderful opportunity. We've got about 15 minutes until the end to just ask our audience, is there anybody here who has any particular questions? We haven't talked a lot about platform. We focus more on sort of the strategic side of things. So that'd be something that you could ask questions about, or really whatever all y'all are interested in. Yeah, and maybe while people kind of ruminate over what questions they want to ask, I'll just ask you both now. Well, maybe I'll start with you, Laura. So right now, you're no longer doing Rainbow Rumpus. You're now the executive director of compassionate action for animals. And I'm just kind of curious, could you tell us a little bit about what you do and maybe some ways to get involved if anybody's interested?
Sure. I guess I'd say, maybe I'll start with, what stories as an audience do you know about pigs?
I know Charlotte's Web. I know that one.
All right. Why don't people type them in the chat? I bet other people have that too. Yep, Olivia. Babe. Yes, Babe. 3 Little Pigs in the Big Bad Wolf. Food processing. Peppa Pig.
Oh, Peppa.
Yeah.
Should I just yell bacon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Potbelly pigs. Yeah. Yeah, these are great. So I'll just tell you a brief story. Yeah, County Fair is about Wally. I don't know if any of you have met or heard of Wally, but Wally now lives at Soul Space Farm Sanctuary, but Wally was on his way down Highway 94. And you can probably guess that Wally was not driving a car. Wally was in the back of a truck, right? Headed to slaughter. And Wally was, with many others, and decided that he was really not going to have any part of this. And he sat there, he got to the back of the truck, he worked at the back with his nose. Everybody behind is like watching this, right? He managed to unlatch the truck and leap out. Wow. And save himself. Yeah. And roll over on 94.
Wow, like a Jason Bourne moment of like out of the car.
Yeah. Until people, came to help him. And he's now getting to live out his life at Soul Space. But it's interesting, as we list these stories about pigs, right? They're pretty much imaginary pigs, or they're in a food context. And I think one thing that's been really interesting to me is how much animals have individual lives, like Wally. And so we have farm sanctuary trips that are coming up where you get to hear stories about animals like this, and just learn a little bit more about animals who we typically think of just as food, in a different kind of context. So we have a pride tour of Little Acorn Sanctuary coming up. We've got another tour of a place called Rooster Redemption coming up. And we host Twin Cities Veg Fest, which is just a big festival with lots of plant-based food and chance to learn about the health benefits of plant-based eating. We've got a booth of registered dietitians there. There were 10,000 people in 2019. We expect about that many people again. It's at Harriet Island Park on September 19th. And I would invite you to consider coming, or coming even with organizations to connect with the broader community there.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And Wally's story, I think, is a great illustration of just the power of story, to really help us, relate to an individual, whether it's a person, or in this case, Wally the pig. I guess, Nausheena, I'd love to hear a little bit about, ways that people can engage with Rise.
Yeah, so we always are looking for nominations to Sheroes. So I know this is shocking, everyone. I don't know every single Muslim woman in Minnesota. I know this is really shocking. So help us connect with the next Shero. You can go to our website and fill out the nomination form. And then second is read those stories, watch those videos, and then share them out. I had a teacher in one of my classes who was, he's like, the next time that I have to do a lesson on women in sports, I'm going to make sure that I actually pull out the girls from the Champlain Park tennis team and showcase these girls who are in hijab, but they're girls that are playing tennis. And so I think there are different ways for you to engage with the content, and not just like a form of education or entertainment, but really to have tougher conversations with your own family members around those misconceptions and myths. And then finally, we are constantly looking for ways to collaborate, and especially in our work around shared liberation and in solidarity. So feel free to, reach out to us and connect with us on ways we could partner. We do a lot just on different policy and different legislative work. And so if there are ways that we can provide more equitable policies for our communities, join us in that fight, and then also invite us into fighting with you and alongside you.
Wonderful. So we gave you a few minutes to kind of think of your questions for our panelists, but I'm not seeing any yet in the chat. So yeah, I don't know. I think since we're not really seeing any feedback there, we pretty much covered all the points we wanted to cover. Nausheena or Laura, do either of you have any other closing thoughts to share?
I don't know. No, I feel like we're good.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I guess I would be curious if anybody who is here in the audience feels like they have experience of a sort of compelling storytelling experience, that has worked for them. I think that would be really interesting to hear.
Mm-hmm. We've actually got a few questions that just kind of came through the transom. One question is, I'm wondering about intersectionality and how you elevate stories to include this and create communities.
So intersectionality, I feel like, is kind of front and center in the work that we do, because we obviously, you obviously see the religion, right? And then there's race. We also have age. We've been for the longest time telling stories of more of like this sort of Gen X group, I would say. But recently we have started telling stories of younger people. We just, told a story of Juwaria Jama, who's only 17 years old and doing a lot of climate justice and environmental justice work. And so, she's a young Black woman who is really out there making sure that our communities are educated about like how climate justice is actually a racial justice inequality as well. And then the other thing is like around ableism. So we have been profiling women who are blind. We've been profiling women who are working in the deaf community. And there's so much more in that space that we haven't touched. And we had somebody who, has who's on the spectrum, right? And so we told her story, and so we're trying to do our best in finding. It's just so diverse, right? When you've got like 10 categories of identifiers, and then you do the math, it's really hard to be able to showcase all of that. And so we continue to strive in making sure that the work is intersectional in terms of their identities. And then what we're trying to really showcase is the intersectionality of movements. And so how does, for example, like Black Lives Matter is really intersecting now with like the cause for Palestine. We are seeing an intersection of like environmental justice with racial inequalities, right? And so when we start to bring our movements together, you really come to realize like we are who we're waiting for, and we are who we need to make change.
I love that. We are who we're waiting for. Yeah, Laura, do you have any comments on that? Otherwise, I've got another quick question for both of you.
Yeah, I would say just in your mind or in the chat if you want, when you think of who eats plant-based or who the vegan community is, if you were going to have a type of person or type of people or type of community and say, where is that growing, who would you think? So having had a minute to think about that, I will share that the African American community is the largest growing community of plant-based eaters in the United States. And the reason for that is because of the health disparities that exist between African Americans and white Americans in particular. And so we are really working to do more work around that issue, really around that issue, right? Around those health disparities and around the differences that plant-based eating can make, because it's critical for the health of our communities. And so as we kind of pull together issues around animals and around health, I think that's one of the places that we are really looking at intersectionality. There's a whole host of ways, but I'll just highlight that one right now.
That's really cool. Yeah, I wouldn't have imagined that. I follow Lizzo on Instagram, so I know that she's vegan now, but that's all I know. So that's cool that that's kind of becoming a movement as well, because it's a very serious issue, and it's very badly needed strategies to address it. Yeah, so we have just like 2 minutes. So quick question. Do either of you have any tools you recommend, like tech tools for getting the word out, or any advice for working with the press?
I want to answer the press one.
Great. Yeah. Because I love the experience there. Yeah.
So with the press, remember, they don't have the information and they're coming to you to get more information. Like, this needs to be the mindset when you're interacting with them. So you get to develop your talking points, and you're going to deliver those talking points. Every time they come in with a question that's like, nope, that's not what I want to answer, you just simply deflect and say, that's a great question, but you know what's a better question? And then you ask your own question and you answer it yourself, okay?
I love this.
So I'll give you an example. Do you remember when in France, there was a Muslim woman on the beach with her burkini and she's covered, and the French police basically made her like take it off in public and then like arrested her, and it was like all over the media, right? So I got a call from a reporter, and her story was like, oh my gosh, Muslim women can't even exercise and they can't even swim. What, like, how is this impacting you? And I was like, hold up. Yeah, we can. Okay. Like, I actually have a membership at the YMCA. I show up just like this, except the material is for working out. And I'm just not alone. There are so many Muslims that the Y welcomes. And like, remember, the Y was a Christian men's group, right? And so the fact that like I'm there should speak volumes of like how things have changed and progressed with the Y. And so she completely changed that story, right? Her story changed immensely about like how much more empowering and lucky and how much freedom we have in the United States because of our diversity and our inclusion. And so that story could have gone to the same like negative rhetoric about how oppressed Muslim women are and we can't do anything. And instead I was like, no, this is not at all what my experience is, right? My lived experience is this. And so when you are going to the press, remember, you and your lived experience, your knowledge, you're the expert, right? Go in there with like confidence of like, you know what you're doing, and then you share out those points with media. And if they have a fantastic story, you thank them, because then they'll come back to you for another story, and then you'll be able to have a more positive story and imagery of who you and your community are.
I love that, because so often you're just like, oh, thank you for talking to me. You know, that power dynamic is there. And so really turning that around and realizing you're the expert and you can help set the agenda. That's a wonderful piece of advice for all of us. Laura, do you have any thoughts about platform or, you know, talking to news folks or any of that good stuff?
You know, I agree with everything that you just said. And I think, you know, if you're at the point of just trying to get attention, you know, just thinking of what you have to share that is perhaps unexpected in some way is often a helpful way if you're just trying to get that beginning of press engagement. And then, it goes to what Nausheena was talking about developing those relationships, thanking people, seeing it as a relationship.
That's great. So kind of countering stereotypes, do you think? Is that sort of one of the ways you approach that?
Yeah.
Yeah, or just doing things that are fresh and new, that kind of thing.
Right.
Cool. Well, that's great advice, and I think a great place to end this panel. Thank you so much, Nausheena and Laura, and thanks so much to you wonderful folks who are organizing this conference and the attendees. Hope you get a lot out of this and the rest of your time here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nausheena. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Cary. Appreciate it so much. This was really entertaining, engaging, learned a lot. So thank you.